She thought it was just another job, a way to keep her hands busy, a way to put food on her own table, and maybe, just maybe, find a little peace in a life that had, until now, been anything but easy. When she answered the call to cook for a group of cowboys on a remote ranch, she never imagined the path it would lead her down. To her, it just sounded simple. Hard, yes, but simple. Rise before dawn, prepare hearty meals, and make sure the men had something warm in their stomachs before they faced the fields. She'd seen worse, much worse. The ranch stretched out under an endless sky, miles of rolling land that seemed to have no memory of the small, cramped world she'd just left behind. When she first arrived, the air itself felt sharp, filled with the smell of dust, dry wood, and horses. Cowboys came and went, their boots scraping against the wooden porch, their voices carrying across the yard. She was the newcomer, the outsider, stepping into a world that operated on rules she didn't yet understand. But all she wanted was a chance to work honestly, to prove her own worth without ever having to ask anyone for pity. Her hands moved fast in the kitchen, chopping, stirring, kneading, always on her feet. The sound of sizzling pans began to mix with the low laughter from the men who waited at the long wooden table. They teased, they joked, but they never went hungry. And slowly, without meaning to, she became part of their rhythm. Meals weren't just food, they were fuel. They were a piece of comfort after brutal hours under the sun. But there was something she didn't know. Among the men she fed each day, one of them wasn't like the others. He wore the same worn boots, carried the same dust on his shoulders, and sat quietly at the same table. To her, he was just another cowboy, another ranch hand who tipped his hat in thanks and went back to work. She had no idea of the truth he carried, or the secret that made him different from all the rest. Before she ever set foot on that ranch, her life had been marked by hardship. Work was scarce, and every dollar was stretched thin. She had known hunger, not the kind that comes from skipping a single meal, but the kind that lingers for days, making your bones ache and your thoughts heavy.
Her hands had grown rough from whatever work she could find, washing, mending, scrubbing floors for people who barely even noticed her presence. Yet she carried on, because stopping was never an option. When she heard about the cooking job, it seemed like both a chance and a risk. Ranch life wasn't for the faint of heart, and feeding a crew of hungry men was no small task. But she had grit. She had been raised to rise early, to put in the effort even when her body longed for rest. And cooking wasn't foreign to her. It was something she knew well, something that reminded her of the few good memories she held on to. So when the offer came, she didn't hesitate. She packed the little she owned and left behind the quiet town that had offered her little more than judgment. The journey to the ranch was long, a dusty trail that wound through broken fences. She arrived at dawn, the sky still streaked with gray and blue. The ranch looked endless. Horses snorted from the corral, their breath rising like smoke in the morning chill. The main house stood sturdy, its wooden frame worn but strong, with a smaller bunkhouse nearby. She stepped into the kitchen, and for just a moment, that old familiar doubt struck her. The stove was old, iron blackened with years of use. Pots and pans hung from hooks, dented and scarred, but serviceable. The shelves held sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat. It was not much, but it was enough. She tied her apron and got to work. That first morning she built the fire high. She kneaded dough until her arms ached, stirred pots until steam clouded her face, and fried bacon until the smell filled every corner of the house. By the time the cowboys filed in, their boots thudding against the floor, the table was set. Biscuits, beans, eggs, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They ate in silence at first. You know that silence, the silence of a room full of people measuring you. They glanced her way with quick, assessing looks. Some nodded in approval. Others just kept their eyes on their plates. She didn't mind. She wasn't there to impress them with words. Her work would speak louder. By the end of the meal, every plate was clean, every cup was drained. The men rose, tipping their hats in quiet thanks, before heading out to the day's labor. She had passed the first test. Day after day the pattern repeated. She rose before the sun, worked until her back ached, and fed the men with whatever the ranch stores allowed. Sometimes it was hearty meals of beef and potatoes. Other times simple stews, stretched thin but flavored with care.
The cowboys began to talk more around her. They started sharing laughter, trading stories about cattle drives and wild nights in town. She didn't join in much, but she listened. Their stories painted pictures of a life rougher and freer than she had ever known. Still, her mind often returned to her own reasons for being there. She hadn't just taken this job for survival. She needed to prove to herself that she was more than the struggle she had endured, that she could build something honest with her own two hands. Each loaf of bread, each pot of stew, it became more than food. It became proof of her resilience. Yet, even as she settled in, that shadow of uncertainty lingered. It's a hard feeling to shake, isn't it? That feeling that you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. She carried the weight of her past, the memories of people who had cast her aside, who had told her she wasn't enough. It was hard to believe this place would be different. But slowly, signs began to appear. A cowboy leaving an extra portion of flour by the kitchen door. Another fixing a broken step on the porch without being asked. One of the younger men tipping his hat each morning with a shy smile. They were small gestures, but they meant something. They told her she was not invisible here. And through it all, she noticed the one man who stood apart. He wasn't louder, nor did he try to draw attention to himself. He worked with the crew, ate at the same table, wore the same dust-stained clothes, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a steadiness. He never rushed his words, and he never wasted them. He watched more than he spoke, and though his eyes rarely lingered on her, she felt the weight of his presence. To her, he was just another cowboy, another man shaped by this hard land. She never guessed that behind his quiet nature lay the secret that would change everything. The days on the ranch fell into that steady rhythm. She was up before the first rooster, the kitchen already warm with fire by the time the cowboys stumbled in, rubbing sleep from their eyes. She found a strange comfort in the routine. It gave her purpose. It kept her from dwelling on the past. The cowboys grew used to her quickly. At first, they were cautious, but hunger softens judgment. Soon, they came to rely on her the way they relied on their saddles and spurs. When the work was long and the nights cold, her food gave 'em strength. They even teased her sometimes, tossing light-hearted jokes across the table, but never cruelly. She wasn't one of 'em, but she wasn't an outsider anymore either.
She noticed their habits. The youngest one always asked for seconds. Another never spoke much, but he'd always set his cup back near the stove for more coffee without asking. And in return, she found herself remembered in ways she hadn't expected. A sack of fresh apples left on the counter, a jar of honey placed by the stove, little signs of respect that slowly chipped away at her doubts. But among all of them, there was one who remained the hardest to read. He sat at the table like the rest. He spoke when needed, laughed occasionally at a joke, but he was watchful, steady in a way the others weren't. While the younger men were quick to fill silence with chatter, he seemed content to just let silence breathe. His hands were strong and sure. His voice was calm. She couldn't decide if he carried more weight on his shoulders or if he simply chose to bear it differently. He never treated her unkindly. If anything, he treated her like he did everyone else, without fuss, without judgment. But she felt a pull toward his quiet nature, though she couldn't understand why. He would offer to carry heavy sacks into the kitchen, his movements efficient. He would nod his thanks after meals, just enough to show he noticed the effort. And when the work outside grew tense, when tempers flared, his was the voice that cut through, calm and steady enough to settle the storm. To her, he just seemed like a cowboy who had seen it all. His boots were as worn as the rest, his shirt patched. If he had a secret, it was buried deep. As the weeks passed, she learned just how harsh this life could be. Storms rolled across the plains without warning. Days of hard rain left mud so thick it swallowed boots. The sun, when it came back, burned until skin blistered. The cowboys worked through it all, and she worked beside them in her own way, keeping them steady with hot meals, no matter how rough the day had been. It was during one of these storms that she saw him in a different light. The winds had been howling all day. The cowboys came in drenched, mud dripping from their clothes, their faces lined with fatigue. She set food before them, and they ate in silence, the storm outside louder than their voices. But when she looked up, she caught his eyes, just for a moment. There was something in them she couldn't name. Something steady, yes, but also protective, as though he carried not just his own weight, but something more. That night, as the wind screamed, she lay awake, her mind circling back to that glance. She told herself it meant nothing. The days after the storm tested everyone. Fences had to be repaired, cattle rounded up. The cowboys grumbled, but not him. He simply did what needed to be done. No complaint, no boasting. She watched him more closely then. One evening, one of the other cowboys teased her about burning the bread. Laughter filled the room, but he, the quiet one, silenced it with a single glance. Not harsh, not unkind, but firm. The teasing ended. She felt a warmth stir in her chest she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, someone had stood for her, even in the smallest way. She thought about how easy it was for people to dismiss her in the past. Yet here, in this rough place, a man who said little had spoken on her behalf without a single word. She didn't know his secret, but something about him unsettled her heart in ways she couldn't yet explain. The weeks stretched into months. The ranch settled into its rhythm, and she had grown stronger. The fears she carried when she first arrived had faded. Her hands were sure as she cooked, her voice firmer. She didn't feel invisible anymore. But her thoughts returned, often, to the quiet one. He still didn't speak much, yet his silence said more than the other's words. He was the one who calmed tempers. He was the one who never complained. She began to notice the small details. He always made sure his horse was cared for before he sat down to eat. And sometimes, late at night, she'd see him walking the edge of the property, as if making sure nothing threatened the place they all depended on. To her, he seemed almost like a guard, more than just a hand. One evening, she was outside by the well, drawing water. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple. She didn't hear him approach, but then he was there, steadying the heavy bucket before it slipped from her grasp. She looked up, surprised. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened in the fading light. "Careful," he said simply, and then he carried the water inside as though it weighed nothing. It was such a small thing, yet it lingered with her. No one had looked out for her in that way for years. When she lay awake that night, she couldn't shake the memory of his hand steadying hers. The truth was still hidden. He blended in too well. The turning point came with another storm, this one harsher than the last. Rain poured in sheets, the river swelled. The man worked day and night, drenched to the bone, pushed to the edge. She did what she could, stretching food, boiling coffee, keeping the fire alive. It was during that storm that she saw him most clearly. While others cursed and argued, he stayed calm. He directed the younger cowboys with steady orders. When one man nearly collapsed from exhaustion, he carried him back to the bunkhouse without a word. She watched through the rain-streaked window as he moved through the storm, unyielding. When the skies finally cleared, the ranch was battered but standing. That night, when they all gathered around the table, tired but alive, she placed food before them with trembling hands. She glanced at him, the quiet cowboy who had carried them all through the storm. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were steady as ever. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Trust. It unsettled her, this growing sense that he was more than he seemed. Why did it feel as though the weight of the entire ranch rested more on his shoulders than anyone else's? She didn't know it, but the truth was already moving closer. The truth that he wasn't just a cowboy. He was the man who owned the land beneath their feet, the man who had chosen to stand among his own workers, watching quietly, waiting to see who they truly were when they thought no one important was watching. He didn't know that her strength, her resilience, and her quiet dignity had already caught his eye in ways she couldn't imagine. After the storm, the real work began. Fences were splintered. The men moved slowly, their bodies aching. She noticed the quiet cowboy more than ever. He was there at sunrise, already moving, checking fences, repairing what was broken. He asked for nothing, took no credit, but it was clear he carried more than his share.
She saw it in the way the younger men looked to him, waiting for direction. She saw it in the way no one questioned his judgment. He wasn't just another hand. He was the one they followed. One afternoon she stepped outside. The sound of hammering echoed from the corral. He was there, sleeves rolled up, driving nails into a broken rail. She hesitated. Then she picked up a handful of nails lying on the ground. Without a word, she held them out to him. He simply looked at her, as if weighing whether to accept the help. Then he nodded, his hand brushing hers as he took them. That small touch sent a shiver through her. They worked in silence for a while. She handed him nails, she held a board steady. When the fence was finally upright, he stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sturdy," he said. She almost smiled. That night she began to wonder more deeply who he really was. No ordinary cowboy carried himself like that, with a steadiness that seemed rooted in the land itself. The truth began to press at the edges of her mind. A few evenings later, a small group of riders came through, men from a neighboring ranch. They stopped for supplies and stayed for a meal. The conversation was lively. Talk of cattle prices, of the storm damage. She kept to her work, listening from the edges. But then she heard one of the visitors laugh and say, "Strange how the owner here keeps himself hidden. You'd think a man with this much land would be easier to spot." The word struck her like a stone. She glanced toward the quiet cowboy, expecting him to look up, to laugh along. But he didn't. He simply kept eating, his face calm, his eyes lowered to his plate. And in that absolute silence she felt the truth click into place. Her hands trembled. She didn't want to believe it, but all the signs she had ignored now stood out, sharp and clear. The way the man listened to him, the way he worked harder than anyone, the way he walked the land at night as though it belonged to him. Because it did. She struggled to keep her breath steady. She had been cooking for him all along. Not just another cowboy, but the man who owned the ranch, the land, perhaps even the lives of those who worked here. And he had chosen not to tell her. That night, after the visitors left, she found herself alone in the kitchen, staring into the dying fire. Her heart pounded. Why had he hidden it? Why live among them as if he were no different? And what did it mean for her? She thought of every meal she had served him, every quiet glance, every small kindness. All of it carried new weight. He hadn't just been another cowboy grateful for her food. He had been the one watching, measuring, perhaps testing. Her world had shifted without warning. Nothing felt simple anymore. The next morning felt different. The men rose at dawn. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, frying bacon, pouring coffee. But her thoughts weren't on the food. They were on him. He entered quietly, as he always did. But now she understood why the atmosphere shifted when he sat down. He wasn't simply respected. He was the one who held everything together. As she placed a plate in front of him, her hand trembled slightly. He didn't look up, only murmured a soft, "Thank you." She wondered if he knew she had pieced it together. She had to wait. That evening, when the men had gone to their bunks, she found herself alone with him. He was at the table, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes.
The scrape of steel against stone filled the silence. She hesitated in the doorway, her heart racing, but then she stepped forward. "You're not just one of them," she said quietly. He looked up. His eyes met hers. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally, he set the knife down. "You figured it out." Her breath caught. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because people act different when they know," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. "I wanted to see who you were, not who you thought you needed to be for the owner." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on her apron. "And what did you see?" He studied her, his eyes searching her face. "I saw someone who doesn't quit," he said at last. "Someone who works harder than anyone gives her credit for. Someone who belongs here more than she realizes." That word, belongs, it struck her deeper than she expected. For years she had been told she wasn't enough, and here was this man, this powerful man, telling her the opposite. "You watched me," she whispered, "without saying a word. Do you know what that feels like? To think you're invisible, only to find out you were being tested?" His brow furrowed. "It wasn't a test, not for you. For me," she blanked. "For you?" He nodded slowly. "I needed to know if I could trust the people around me. Men can lie when they want something from the boss, but when they think you're just another hand, they show their true selves. That's the only way I know who belongs here." She let the words sink in. "And do I belong here?" His eyes softened just enough. "You've proved that a dozen times over." The fire crackled. She felt her heart beat faster. For the first time, she didn't see him as just the quiet cowboy or even the owner. She saw him as a man who had chosen to carry the weight of others, even when it meant hiding who he really was. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew the truth had changed everything. The next morning, when the man filed in for breakfast, she caught his eye across the table. He gave the same quiet nod he always did, but this time it carried a new meaning. She wasn't just the cook anymore, and he wasn't just another cowboy. Something unspoken connected them now. The days ahead would bring more work, more storms, but as she watched him rise from the table, shoulders squared, gaze steady, she felt a flicker of strength she hadn't known in years. The land was his, yes, but in some way she couldn't yet explain, it felt like it was becoming hers, too.